I would argue that the country I am most concerned about is Germany. Because of the Ukraine war, they have lost access to Russian natural gas, which provided them, in terms of their gross consumption, 40% of the total. And even though they've been able to replace the gas, it's an inelastic market, so natural gas prices in Germany are now 6 times what they were before the war. And Germany is not like the United States. We like to talk a good talk about how we want energy independence, but we really don't care. So we'll take it from Canada or Mexico or Saudi Arabia. We'll make some ourselves. If we don't think anyone's looking, we'll take some from Venezuela. But the Germans can't do that. They're in a more difficult neighborhood, and precision manufacturing requires reliability. So they work with large state-owned companies that export on fixed contracts through fixed infrastructure. And when that broke down, it didn't just interrupt their natural gas supplies. Those natural gas supplies also provide their electricity, and they also provide the inputs for their petrochemical sector. And the petrochemical output is not exported, it's kept in-house to undergird the entire manufacturing sector. So the entire German manufacturing model has basically collapsed. All non-ferrous metal processing has gone away. All fertilizer processing has gone away. We're already seeing automotive down by a third without any change in demand globally. We are probably going to be looking at the end of the German manufacturing model in less than 2 years. What does Germany have going for it if it doesn't have energy, food, or manufacturing? This is a very different world unless you know your German history, in which case this is a very familiar song. And when the Germans feel stressed economically, things spin out of control in a very short period of time, and no one cares who votes for who. One of the big effects of globalization was it made countries' local geographies really not matter. The Americans took care of economic security and physical security, and if they do that, then you can do pretty much whatever you want. And this has enabled countries like Germany and Korea to do very well for the last 75 years. If the Americans step back, if geography matters again, if demographics are still in flux and declining, it's not a great picture overall, certainly not on average, but there are plenty of places where the geography is actually really good. And there are some places where the demographics are just fine. And those places, freed of the competition from those places that have basically been subsidized by the American strategic order, they're going to do great. So, I'm a big fan of the United States. We've got the best demography in the rich world. We've got ocean moats. We've got a great partner in Mexico that is not just proximate, but demographically robust. I can see any number of economic sectors in the North American space doing great. I think we're going to double the size of our industrial plant over the next 5 years. I see our presence in food and agricultural markets exploding because we're going to be some of the very few positions in the planet that can actually maintain or even expand output. In the European space, watch the Scandinavians. They are not, for the most part, integrated with continental Europe, certainly not with the Germans. They've got their own energy supplies from the North Sea, and they've got excellent relations not just with the Brits, but with the Americans as well. So I can see, in some way, a degree of economic association that could work for them very, very well, especially if Russia loses this war. In terms of East Asia, look to Japan, not because it has a great geography for economic development, it doesn't, or a good demography, it's the oldest in the world, but the Japanese saw the writing on the wall, and they realized that their demographics were terminal, and they realized that economically, if they couldn't part with the United States, it wasn't even worth trying. So they got a humiliating trade deal with the Trump administration. And then when the Biden administration came in, they communicated that they have no desire to change the terms. They have found a way to get along with both sides of the American political aisle in the midst of our transition. That is a big achievement, and they managed to pull it off. So they're now part of the Friends and Family Network and kind of piggyback on the strengths of North America. Southeast Asia looks great to me. They're going to pick up a lot of the manufacturing that the Chinese and Europeans are going to drop. And they're young enough demographically that they're going to be a powerful pole of consumption all by themselves. So don't think of this as the end of everything. Think of this as the end of a chapter. We're moving into a new era where the rules have shifted, and what makes up a geography of success is going to look a lot more familiar to what it did before 1945 than in this artificial period from 1945 to 2020.
Is there anything we can learn from Japan's desourcing strategy when they saw their demographic collapse and went to desourcing, set up plants, Toyota plants, and then through the US and elsewhere? Or is it just too late for that?
There are some countries that might, emphasis on the word might, be able to pull it off. The advantage that the Japanese had is they started this back in the mid-1990s. They realized as early as 1985 that their demographics were terminal, which incidentally is about the same time they turned terminal in Germany. And they started working on things to make it better. So that is automation, that is outsourcing or desourcing or whichever sourcing you want to call it. Making sure that other countries with better demographics, with consumption bases, have a vested interest in the success of Japanese companies. And they did it at scale. But it took them 30 years. What we're going to be seeing over the next 5 years is companies coming to this very late to the game, and it'll probably be a corporate-driven strategy as firms are desperate to get exposure to consumption bases, as opposed to a state-driven strategy like it was in Japan, where it was about national survival, and that's a very different list of countries. So to a degree, I can see the Brits and the Dutch pulling that off, but that's a really small carry. Those aren't huge countries, and the Brits actually have a pretty healthy demography by European standards already. Germany can't do this. It's too late. And there are more people in Germany in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their teens and children. So the scale of displacement that would have to happen is beyond the capacity of Germany to finance, and it would destroy the German employment base anyway, but they're going to try. BASF is probably the best current example. They're in the process of literally dismantling their chemical facilities in Germany and shipping them over to Louisiana in a desperate attempt to generate enough petrochemical outcomes that they can then export those outcomes back to Germany to try to save the country's development model. But that would require a build-out that would be faster in the next 2 years in Louisiana than what the Nazis did at the height of World War II. So color me skeptical. The Russian internal territories are a big, flat, wide open. And the only way that the Russians have ever discovered that they can actually secure their borders is to forward position in some geographic access points between a few natural barriers. So for example, between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathians, you have the Polish Gap, which is about a 150-mile wide access point. Try to get a military footprint in that gap. Same in Bessarabia, same in the Caucasus, and so on. So that's the why. This war was always going to happen. In fact, it's already happened several times. The second question is timing. And the Russian ethnicity is flat out dying out. And if they didn't act this year, I would argue that the Russian military would have not had enough 20-something Russian men to draft to even attempt the war in the future. So it always had to happen. It probably always had to happen right